Hi, I'm Ryan. And what's unitary executive theory?
And do something illegal. Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
By definition.
Exactly. If the president, if for example...
Nixon's back!
The short answer is that it's a constitutional doctrine, claiming that every drop of executive power granted by Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution belongs to a single officer, the president, and that Congress or the courts can't carve pieces of that power away without defying the constitutional design. Advocates of unitary executive theory, or UET, emphasize three textual pillars. First comes the vesting clause, whose stark promise that executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America contains no limiting phrase, like the one that qualifies legislative power in Article 1. Second is the take care clause, which obliges the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. A duty that, proponents say, implies the authority to direct and, if necessary, dismiss subordinates who frustrate that mission. Third is the oath clause, by which the president swears to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. A pledge that some Unitarians read as permission, even obligation, to refuse enforcement of statutes viewed as unconstitutional. If those clauses are indeed taken at face value, the president must be able to hire, fire, and supervise every executive branch official, resist attempts to insulate agencies from White House control, and speak with final authority on questions of administration at home and abroad. The promised payoff, Alexander Hamilton insisted in the Federalist Papers, is energetic government and democratic accountability. With only one head of the executive, the blame can be assigned to someone who can then be punished.
Okay.
Oh, wow,
That's amazing.
Unitary executive theory, therefore, revolves around two operational claims. First, Congress may not wedge itself between the president and the president's subordinates by, for example, giving commissioners for-cause tenure or appointing independent counsels who can't be removed at the will of the president. Second, because political responsibility ultimately funnels to a single elected official, the president must retain the practical power to steer policy across the entire executive branch, whether that means ghostwriting regulations through the Office of Management and Budget, issuing signing statements to narrow statutes, or directing military force abroad. Those two propositions, for the sake of our video today, form the Unitarian core. Everything else, the number of signing statements, the breadth of war powers, the reach of emergency authority, follows from or pushes back against that core.
Listen, I don't want a president who's warm on the outside and warm on the inside too. I want one that's warm on the outside, but I want one who, when the tough decisions are made, is cold and tough and will make the right decision without fear of failure.
The story of how we got here begins long before anyone coined the term unitary executive. During the 1787 Constitutional Convention, delegates rejected plural executives and executive councils. James Wilson praised a single president for the decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch that no committee could match, and the final Constitution locked that vision into Article 2. Almost immediately, the first Congress confronted the practical question of control. In the so-called Decision of 1789, James Madison persuaded colleagues that the president alone must enjoy the removal power, lest responsibility for administration dissolve into finger-pointing. George Washington governed on that understanding, treating his cabinet as advisors, not co-equal partners, while Alexander Hamilton, writing as Pacificus in 1793, defended presidential authority in foreign affairs, and later abandoned his earlier suggestion that the Senate shared removal powers. We'll get more into that flip-flop later. 19th century presidents cemented the pattern. Thomas Jefferson, after decrying monarchical tendencies of the executive in 1787, discovered in office that only a unified executive could prevent absolute inaction. Andrew Jackson dramatized the point by firing Treasury Secretary William Duane when Duane refused to remove federal deposits from the Bank of the United States. To be fair, Jackson also thought the federal bank was essentially evil, but I digress. When Congress tried to handcuff Andrew Johnson with the Tenure of Office Act in 1867, Johnson declared the statute an unconstitutional invasion of presidential removal power. His impeachment and narrow acquittal left Unitarians claiming vindication for their theories. Industrialization and the rise of an administrative state complicated everything. The Interstate Commerce Commission of 1887 foreshadowed independent agencies, yet courts at first refused to concede new turf. In Parsons v. United States, the Supreme Court reaffirmed presidential removal authority, and in Myers v. United States, Chief Justice and former President William Howard Taft declared the power absolute for purely executive officers. But 9 years later, in Humphrey's Executor, the court drew a bright line around multi-member commissions, allowing Congress to protect them with for-cause tenure and challenging every president from Franklin Roosevelt forward to claw back control. Franklin Roosevelt's Brownlow Committee in 1937 urged a single strong chief executive, but Congress balked, accepting only piecemeal reorganization of the bureaucracy. The pendulum swung again under Richard Nixon, perhaps the most infamous Unitarian president until Donald Trump in the 21st century, by converting the Bureau of Budget into the muscular Office of Management and Budget in 1970, expanding White House regulatory review, and practicing what critics called an administrative presidency. Nixon centralized policy authority. Nixon's dramatic Saturday Night Massacre, ordering the firing of Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox when Cox probed the Watergate scandal, was a raw assertion of unitary prerogative. The collapse of his presidency triggered a reform wave, including the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 and its independent counsel provision, designed precisely to pull back the president's authority once again. Those post-Watergate constraints provoked a counter-movement. Inside Ronald Reagan's Justice Department, conservative lawyers such as Edwin Messi, Samuel Alito, and Stephen Calabresi sharpened the theory and coined the official name Unitary Executive Theory. Reagan's Executive Order 12291 imposed centralized cost-benefit review on agency rules. Solicitor General Charles Freed argued in court that the Constitution's structure, even if not its literal words, compelled presidential control. When the Supreme Court struck down the legislative veto in INS v. Chadha and 5 years later upheld the independent counsel statute in Morrison v. Olson, the human manifestation of Droopy from Looney Tunes, Justice Antonin Scalia's solitary dissent, insisting that "this wolf comes as a wolf," became the Unitarian movement's manifesto. Here, Scalia refers to the idea that some government actions, like the independent counsel law in that case, are so clearly a threat to the balance of power, particularly the power of the executive, that they are not disguised in any way, unlike some cases where the threat is more subtle and hidden. In the 21st century, the theory went even more mainstream. George W. Bush embraced a strong variant of UET, claiming inherent authority in foreign affairs, expanding surveillance, and peppering legislation with signing statements. Barack Obama, initially shy of imperial presidency charges, nonetheless leaned on unilateral tools for climate, immigration, and economic crises. Donald Trump swung the pendulum even further in his first administration, proclaiming that Article 2 gave him the right to do whatever I want, and framing career civil servants as a hostile deep state. Joe Biden didn't renounce those instruments. Pandemic mandates and student loan relief orders illustrate what scholars call the accumulation of power over time. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court in Celia Law LLC v. CFPB struck down for-cause protections for single-director agencies, nudging doctrine back towards Myers and shrinking Humphrey's Executor without overruling it. The second Trump administration has pushed UET even further, often willfully ignoring court orders and firing nonpartisan administrative heads at will.
Mr. President, why did you fire the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics? Because I think her numbers were wrong. Just like I thought her numbers were wrong before the election.
Holy that was a lot. Point is, unitary executive theory is a very old way of looking at the Constitution with lots of very new fans.
Mr. President, what are you doing up there?
Unitarians tie their reading of constitutional doctrine to both text and function. They argue that the Constitution's plain language lodges all executive power in one person, and that system of separated powers only works if each branch can protect its orbit. If Congress could fence off blocks of bureaucrats, publicly funded yet shielded from presidential discipline, the responsibility would fragment, and democratic accountability would fade. Hamilton's celebrated defense of the executive in Federalist 70 targeted that exact worry. Unity, he wrote, yields decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch, all of which are indispensable in crises. Modern proponents, notably Calabresi and Christopher Yu, add an historical claim. Every one of the first 43 presidents, from Washington to Bush 43 and beyond, we can assume, asserted control over subordinate officers and resisted congressional infringement, forming an unbroken chain of practice of UET. The only debate of significance, as I see it, inside the pro-camp is how far the logic travels. Reagan-era lawyers pitched a weak theory focused on personnel management. Vice President Dick Cheney, under George Bush, 43, and Berkeley scholar John Yoo went further, declaring that in foreign affairs, Congress cannot constrain the commander-in-chief whatsoever, and that presidential decisions to use military force are for him alone and are unreviewable.
Our government has a firm policy not to capitulate to terrorist demands, that no concessions policy remains in force. In spite of the wildly speculative and false stories about arms for hostages and alleged ransom payments, we did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages.
Opponents to UET press three main critiques. The first is historical. Critics say that whatever the text may suggest, practice has not been consistent as Unitarians claim. Hamilton himself wrote elsewhere in the Federalist, before revising his position, that the Senate would share removal power. Early statutes sometimes imposed collective or fixed-term arrangements, and the very invention of independent agencies at the dawn of the 20th century arose from bipartisan distrust of pure presidential control. The second critique is structural. The framers feared concentrated authority and erected checks and balances to dilute it. A doctrine that lets presidents fire regulators, rewrite laws and signing statements, or brandish emergency powers with minimal oversight risks creating the imperial presidency that Arthur Schlesinger warned about after the Vietnam War and Watergate. The third critique is functional. No modern president can personally oversee more than 2 million civilian employees and counting. To imagine otherwise is fantasy. Worse, centralization can smother transparency. Scholars find that strong unity presidencies often cloak decisions in classified memos or resist oversight, undermining the very accountability unitary theory proposes. Finally, detractors warn that a leader convinced of unchecked authority may act rashly. Who'da thunk it? From post-9/11 detention and interrogation policies, to novel uses of emergency declarations, to massive deportations without due process, the hazards of unilateralism are no longer hypothetical. Where, then, does power really sit for the executive? In one sense, the unitary executive is already the working reality. Every modern president, Democrat or Republican, has deployed centralized review, White House-led rulemaking, sweeping executive orders, and rapid-fire national security directives. Courts, too, drift towards deference when the White House asserts managerial need. Just look at the recent decision in Trump v. United States, in which the Supreme Court determined that the president could not be prosecuted for any act taken in his official capacity as the president. Yet, the pendulum still swings. Congress can let an independent counsel statute expire, as it did in 1999, or revive oversight through funding strings. The Supreme Court can, hypothetically, constrain removals today and trim them tomorrow. Most of all, elections can reward or punish presidents for how they wield unitarian tools. The hard question isn't whether UET exists. For better or worse, from small to expansive degrees, unity, it seems, is baked into Article 2. The question is how thick the guardrails must be to keep that unity from metastasizing to domination. Proponents believe that an energetic singular president is indispensable when crises demand speed and secrecy, and that voters armed with knowledge of who's in charge can throw the rascal out. Critics mindful of secrecy and creeping authoritarianism reply that the same concentration greases the rails for abuse. As the administrative state grows more complex and partisan gridlock or blind acquiescence to the executive freezes legislative oversight, the practical check may lie less in parchment barriers and more in civic vigilance. Media scrutiny, bureaucratic resistance, and ultimately the electorate's willingness to scrutinize presidential claims of necessity. Wow, that was a bit of a dark one, but we're through it. There's a list of references, as always, cited in this video in the description below. In the next one, we're going to dive into the Supreme Court and a potentially massive challenge to its power. Until next time.